Good afternoon. Once again, it is good, isn't it, that we can gather together as we have today. This morning in class and studying God's beautiful word through the book of the Gospel according to John, there in John 6, having looked and sang praises this morning, having said and heard wonderful prayers, and studied from God's word this morning, and then been able to fellowship even longer by enjoying such wonderful meal that so many have took time out of their day today and yesterday to prepare, and what a wonderful opportunity that is. And then we get to come back again on a day like today. On a day like this where we can worship our great and awesome God again. This morning as we looked at the idea and examined God's love, having last Sunday saw God's love even for man in his sin, and then this morning looking at God's love in salvation and all that God proclaimed and all God fulfilled, and bringing about hope for each and every one of us and salvation from it. And as we think of that and all God is and all that God has done, that brings us to a series of lessons we're going to begin here on third Sundays from the book of Proverbs. Because as one tries to contemplate and meditate upon the Word and how awesome and truly amazing God is, it doesn't take long for the open heart, the heart that strives for truth and righteousness, to see how amazing He is. And yet, so many people in the world, and it's growing, it seems daily, have become foolish really towards God. This afternoon, we're going to look beginning with this idea of the Proverbs and what it declares concerning wisdom and foolishness. The book of Proverbs really is a noteworthy book when we think of its intensely practical nature, isn't it? In fact, that's what a proverb is a short, pithy statement that gives you practical advice. Now, the book of Proverbs, of course, is filled with practical advice for those who would desire to live godly and righteous lives. It gives great advice on how to live this and do this each and every day. It isn't a book many would really consider going to when it comes to talking about the existence of God, for example, to counter atheism or God's wisdom in creation. These are what are typically called theological discussions, and people would think of maybe the book of Romans for that. People would think of maybe going to the gospel accounts or things of that nature, books like that. But when it comes to the book of Proverbs, when you really get down and think about it, what's more practical than knowing about God? We learn who God is through the mind He has given us, 1 Corinthians 2, 10 through 16. We learn who God is through the Scriptures, through what He has delivered to us. And what's more practical than knowing God or knowing Him through this impractical means of what is wisdom and what isn't. So with this in mind, I want us to examine our lesson for today. If you have your handout, notice the first point is God exists. God exists. Now, before we go any further, I want to, for just a moment, to spend just a little bit of time concerning atheism in a basic nutshell form. There are two kinds of atheism in the world. And I'm not talking about agnosticism, but there are two kinds of atheism in the world. The first that we're going to talk about, philosophical atheism, is one that's really kind of grown over the last couple of decades. What I mean by philosophical atheism, that is this idea of not just denying that God exists, but claiming that there is evidence that proves God does not exist. And then we've seen this as those who are older than a couple of decades. You've seen this grow, haven't you? You've seen those who would go from saying, listen, we just don't believe in God, to those who say, we know for a fact, based on the evidence, that God doesn't exist. This is philosophical atheism, and it's become more and more aggressive. I think that's why it's growing in not only America, but other places, where it's been growing even longer. People like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and others who have been very aggressive in this, in court cases and other places where one can get the quote-unquote final say, and they'll say things like, listen, we can prove and know God doesn't exist. And so there's this more aggressive, more in-your-face, if you will, idea of atheism that isn't okay with just saying we don't believe that God exists. It wants to attack anyone who would. Then there's another form, and that is practical atheism. Now this one's much more widespread. Practical atheism is this idea where people don't overtly or rudely deny God's existence. They just simply live their lives in such a way that they don't live as if God exists. Now, they're not really going to go one way or the other in what they tell you. Listen, they'll let you live however you want, but they're going to live their life in such a way that God doesn't exist. Now, unfortunately, that can in some ways apply to those who would even say they believe in God to some degree. It's one thing to say you believe, but it's another thing to say you follow. When you live a life that says you don't believe in any form or fashion of God, and your life dictates that, that's a form of practical atheism. And the reason I bring this up is because it's important to look at that and understand these cases. Because this is a push and has been a push for a long time. But when we look at the book of Proverbs, we see that this great book on wisdom and folly, foolishness, and that which leads to understanding. It gives us actually great insight into this mentality that God does not exist. What we end up reading from it, seeing and understanding, is that there is an existence of God described. Now, I'll be the first to say, listen, when you're dealing with philosophical atheism, those who are just out blatant, I can prove God doesn't exist, you can't go to the Bible. To prove God exists, they don't believe in the Bible. You have to go through other avenues. Science is a great way to prove God exists. I know they don't talk about it in the media and stuff like that, but science actually proves God exists. But for those that are practical atheists, those who aren't, in other words, practicing, they actually believe in God, we can go and look at what is wise and what is not. And the Proverbs even begin, if you have your Bible, look at Proverbs chapter 1 as we look at it here. In Proverbs 1 verse 7, the great wise Solomon says this, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction." Now, one of the things you'll see with people in general, unfortunately, is a desire to stay ignorant. When truth and facts, when wisdom is deployed, people oftentimes, if it goes against what they believe or they want, they would rather believe what they want rather than the truth, rather than facts. That's why the world's in the situation it's in, let's be honest. That's why we hear things like, well, truth is relative. I can make truth whatever I want it to be. But Solomon, inspired by God, says, listen, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. He would go on to say in chapter 2, verses 4 through 6, this, "If you seek it like silver," that idea of wisdom and instruction, "if you seek it like silver and search for it as for hidden treasure, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. For the Lord gives wisdom, from his mouth comes knowledge and understanding." There's a simple translation for all of this. It's foolish not to know God. It's not wise to not look at all the facts and examine all the truth. The psalmist would put it a little bit more bluntly in Psalm 14, 1 and 2. "The fool says in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They are of abominable deeds. There is none who does good. The Lord looks down from heaven on the children of man to see if there are any who understand, who seek after God." What's he trying to say? It's not that God will remove our freedom of choice here on earth. He won't. He created us with that ability to choose. In fact, inherent in our loving him is that choice here on earth. That ability to make the observations, to use our faculties, and the things around us, as Romans would say in Romans chapter 1, listen, God is clearly seen through the things He has created. When it comes to the reality of God and whether or not He exists, the one who rejects the evidence is foolish. The one who rejects the preponderance of evidence. And for some reason, our society, we've grappled and clawed our way to this idea that there's prominence in rejecting God and His existence. Actually, just a couple of days ago, I was reading an article where three prominent scientists, by name only really, but three prominent scientists all said, listen, no great scientist has ever believed in God. And yet they would call Isaac Newton a great scientist, and he believed in God. And we could go, that's just one, but we could go on and on. There are several. In fact, it's not till more recently that that's more the case than not. Science has always proved God exists. The reality of facts have always proved this. There are two prominent thoughts that come forth from what we have seen in Proverbs here and in the Psalms. First, those that deny God exists are corrupted. They've chosen to ignore facts. They've chosen to ignore true wisdom. And they corrupt, and in their corruption they create abominable deeds. This is what we see. Those who believe they are God unto themselves and can make up the rules as they go, as they see fit, as they desire of their own, it's not surprising that immorality follows. And also we see that everyone that has an unclouded heart, that goes at the facts searching for truth, is not foolish but wise, who listens to instruction. There is no wisdom outside of God. It's foolishness. It's crazy. I saw someone just the other day who asked the question, who said, I keep seeing scientists being quoted from, and they talk about this issue and that issue that aren't biblical, but what about the other 1,000 that signed a paper a couple of years ago saying we believe God exists, and here's the facts behind it. The 1,000, now they believe that 100 that make up all the rules over in Europe, but of the 1,000 who disagree, you never hear them talking about them. You never hear about the events that took place just a couple of years ago where they were atheists, all of them atheists, were saying Darwin's evolution is farce. There's no actual facts for it. Now, they weren't saying they believed in God. They weren't even saying they think that evolution itself was wrong. They were kind of changing it around. They said, listen, there's no facts for Darwinism. It just doesn't exist. We never heard a peep from that. Brothers and sisters, the Proverbs are clear. To be wise, we must understand God. Know that God exists. We cannot be wise without that. In fact, we end up being foolish. The second thing I want to talk about quickly is God created the world by wisdom. There's a reason why the facts don't add up. There's a reason why these facts on evolution and things simply don't add up, or especially atheism doesn't add up and such. Why? Well, when we think about it, we look at foolishness abounds in atheistic creation. It doesn't take but a moment to see how foolish atheism is when we begin to look at the universe and the science around us. Basic atheistic evolution claims the universe is here simply by chance and that there is no cause for creator. Now, none of them really believe that because it's illogical. We've all heard the stories of the debates that have gone on where one's taken a hammer and broke the watch and said, okay, how many years is it going to take to put it back together? Well, it's illogical. It doesn't make any sense. They understand that. They realize that, but they won't accept it. They won't accept that it doesn't make. In fact, not too long ago, actually I'm getting older now, it's about 15 years ago, a scientists tried to mathematically deduce what's the actual mathematical chances for there to be no God and for evolution to be how it is. And they put it at 100 and 4 million times the 4 million. That was the mathematical possibility of it being true. Why? The facts don't add up. Some atheists and evolutionists claim that the universe simply appeared. And though they say there is design, it really wasn't by a God. Now this again is illogical. They will admit that it's not chaotic, that there is design in the universe we have, but it can't be from a God. Now, imagine if a scientist goes, and this has happened, and let's say they're in Brazil or some other place, and they come across a ruin. And imagine if that scientist said, listen, no one created that. That's not the question they asked. They asked who created it. Why? Design. If there's design, there's a designer. It's always and forever been that way. Design doesn't come from chaos. Imagine the scientist, if he said, listen, I think these Mayan temples were just simply appeared, developed themselves and was not created. They'd be laughed out of their minds. They'd be ruined. But when it comes to the universe, that's not the case. The reality is that God's wisdom created the universe. And in the book of Proverbs, it beautifully states such. In Proverbs chapter 3, 19 through 20, let's read it together. The Lord by wisdom found the earth. By understanding he established the heavens. By his knowledge the deeps broke open, and the clouds dropped down the dew. Look at that again. Not only do we see God wisely created the universe, but that it functions by virtue of wisdom. In other words, it's designed. Everything God made is infused with wisdom. Right after making this great point on wisdom in creation, right after this in Proverbs 3, 21 through 26, he would go on to say this, my son, do not lose sight of these. Keep sound wisdom and discretion, and they will be life for your soul, an adornment for your neck. Then you will walk on your way securely, and your foot will not stumble. If you lie down, you will not be afraid when you lie down. Your sleep will be sweet. Do not be afraid of sudden terror or the ruin of the wicked when it comes, for the Lord will be your confidence and will keep your foot from being caught. All that was said if what? His son saw the wisdom in God's creation and the wisdom he infused in it. The point is this, if we live in a world created by wisdom, it only makes sense to acknowledge that wisdom and life came from it. If you do as the proverb writer said, the Lord will be your confidence. The fool says in his heart there is no God, not because he's got some magical wand that tells him everything, but because he ignores the facts and the truth. And anyone who ignores instruction, who ignores the majority, and don't kid yourself, the majority believe in God and Creator. Anyone who ignores the facts and majority who base their thoughts on the facts have become fools in the sight of God. We must not ever be foolish. That doesn't mean we won't mess up. That doesn't mean we won't fall short from time to time. But when it comes to knowing God and who He is, we must not disregard the abundance of evidence, but rather follow the facts. God is God, and as we talked about this morning, He loves us. I was asked just this afternoon, why did God create us? I said the answer is simple. He loves us. The same reason a parent in this chaotic world, knowing the dangers that could come, would have a child. It doesn't make any logical sense in that sense of the dangers and the problems and the things. Why do parents have children? Because they love them. God has us, created us, and He does so individually, each one, because He loves us. And He desires to have a relationship with us, to know us, and to be there for us. He wants that with you and I. Together, as we study the Word, we study the facts where they lead us, not being led by anything else. As we study the facts, let us be led to wisdom. Let us pray for it, James chapter 1. Let us seek it, not of our own accord, our own desires, our own wants, our own manipulations. Let us with an open heart and an open mind seek truth. As Jesus said in John chapter 8, verse 32, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you or set you free. So it is this afternoon, if there's someone here who needs God, who needs His truth, and maybe you've been floundering in foolishness and you would like to get into the Word and study the Word and see the wisdom that comes from God, let us do it with you. Let us work together in this. Let us discover what God wants from us together. As Paul would say in 1 Corinthians 1 and verse 10, let us have the same mind, speak the same things, and be of the same judgment. Let us do that together. If there's someone here today who needs the prayers of this congregation, who would like to study further in God's Word, let us know by coming forward as we stand and as we sing.